Welcome back, B.F.D followers. I'm hoping that you were successful in your main triangle creation. That's where we left off last time. We had just finished welding up the main triangle. So I hope you had success and you're ready to move on to the chainstay. And that was what I was going to talk to you about today, but I had a bit of a misstep, misfortune, a kind of a stupid mistake. I actually broke my jig. I dropped it and I took out the chainstay mount. My jig is probably somewhere a little over 50 pounds, maybe a little more. And I was just moving it around. I thought I had it balanced, and it rolled right off my table and just took out the mount. So I'm having to fabricate a new one, and so it's going to take me a little while. But I thought this would be a great opportunity to talk to you about the significance, the importance of getting that rear chainstay mount accurate and straight on perfect. It has the most effect on the performance of your bike than anything else, other than maybe your head tube angle. And when I say angle, I don't mean how steep it is. I mean lateral, left or right, a twist maybe, you might say. That would cause your front wheel and fork to be tucked off to a side rather than up, forward, and aft. Anyway, I'm sorry. I use fore and aft because I'm ex-aircraft manufacturing engineering. So forward, aft, backwards, left and right, inboard and outboard. Okay? Just so that we, if you catch me talking in different terms here, you kind of might be able to figure out what I'm talking about. Anyway, let's hop into this, and I'll tell you what I'm going to do. Okay, so let's talk about relationships. And before you get going and go off on a tangent here, I do not mean with your significant other or your pet or anything like that, your friends. I'm talking about the relationship between the angles and distances on your jig, because they directly correlate to the performance of your bike. And so what I want to show you, or show and talk, is this relationship. It's your bottom bracket and the perpendicularity to your jig, okay, because it has to be normal to your tubes and your headset or your head tube. And then you have your chainstay mount, which you can see this is not the original. It's just some plates now that I have kind of lightly bolted and clamped just to give you a representation, because like I said, I need to make a new one. But the relationship here is that where your dummy axle resides has to have a parallel relationship to your bottom bracket and the center line, because that is your zero mark, zero rise. So when we're talking about rise and drop on your chainstay on the axle, it's how far does that bottom bracket and chainstay axle differ. So a zero would be where the axle is in line with your bottom bracket. Okay, and so if we talk about, let's say fairly tall, aggressive hardtail, you might, let's say a 27.5 wheel size, you might look at like a zero or maybe a half-inch difference where the rise or the drop. When I say rise, I'm talking about the axle relationship to the bottom bracket. If I say drop, it's the relationship of the bottom bracket to the axle. So if I say rise, the axle is actually going up in altitude in the Z direction on the seat tube. So a 27.5 aggressive hardtail might only have like a ½ inch or less. So that relationship will be somewhere right here to here. With a road bike or gravel bike, you'll probably see something like 2.5 inch differential, right? So that relationship is controlled by your ChainStay jig. And the other relationship is how it tilts. This is critical. I can't stress that enough. If you have a mount that puts your axle on a slight angle, your tire is going to be off like that because it's going to be normal to the axle. So any type of variation, right? So you got to make sure that this axle is parallel to your bottom bracket. Any variation like that, you're going to be screaming and shouting when you look at the tire mount. Okay. Now you can make some corrections with the drops themselves on your ChainStay tubes, but most of the time those are already welded on by the time you go to mount the chainstays to the bottom bracket. And what you do is you end up having to cut or loosen them some way and then readjust them to account for that tilt. Unfortunately, then what you're going to see is your chainstay tubes are going to be, one's going to be high or low or in and out depending on how it's twisted, right? So you can have it tilting like this in the up down or in a yaw, all of which are bad. You do not want to have any type of out of alignment out from your bottom bracket. It is critical. Okay. The next thing that you have to worry about, and when I say worry, again, this is so important that you have to be consciously thinking about this and write it down. Because when you design your jig and you get going and you forget one thing, that checklist, you're going to pay for it by throwing away your frame that you just made, or cutting off your chainstays and having to buy new tubes. So make a checklist on what needs to be done. So parallel with the bottom bracket, forward, aft, up, down, yaw, any direction. All right. The other one is identify the center line on your dummy axle, because that center line needs to line up with the center of your bottom bracket. So right down the center of your tube, all the way down to your bottom bracket center line, right? So this dummy axle has to be centered. Otherwise, your ends are going to be favoring one side or the other, and that will cause your chainstays to flare out. One will be straighter, one will be flared out, and you'll get that crooked tire again, or it will be hugging one chainstay more than the other. And I tell you, that's frustrating. Technically, or ride-wise, that's doable, right? You can true your wheel off to the other side as long as it's not a gross true mistake. You can do maybe a 1/4 inch realignment. But if you have a spare wheel that you just want to throw on because you have winter wheels, summer wheels, racing wheels, whatever, you're going to have to true every one of them off. And then if you let someone else borrow your wheel, or you borrow someone else's wheel, it's not going to work. Someone's going to say, your tires or your wheels are all out of whack. Why is that? And well, because you got a misalignment down here on your bottom bracket, or in this case, your dummy axle. The same thing can happen to your bottom bracket too. That's why that center line of your bottom bracket needs to be perpendicular to your jig. Otherwise, you're going to have the same problem. Your frame's going to feel crooked and it won't ride that well. Yeah, and while we're on it, the same thing goes for that head tube. If it's out too, you'll notice it. I made one where it was just a fraction out. It was doable, rideable. I didn't really notice it, but I know it was there, and I couldn't not help but focus on it. And I thought everyone could see it, even when maybe they couldn't. No one ever said anything. Even my one bike that I made that the back wheel was slightly off. I could tell that it was 98th of an inch off by looking at the back wheel and the seat tube, but I never had anyone say anything about it. So, but you will see it, and you will dwell on it, and it will bother you to no end, and you'll make a new frame. I have to admit that it bothered me so much, I cut the chainstays off and put them back on again. Okay, so what does that mean in real life here, right? What does that look like? And like I said, this is my jig that's just thrown together with a bunch of little angles. And you can see that it's loose, but to talk about what needs to be done is this strong back here needs to be rigid enough to hold the extension plate that will hold the mount for your dummy axle. See, you can work in either direction, right? You can work with getting the dummy axle aligned and then mount it to a plate, figure out how square it needs to be, whether it needs to be up, down, and then mark it onto your strong back and so forth. I found that to be difficult. It's best just to start from the base and make sure that all your parts are normal to each other, perpendicular and straight and flat. Okay, start there, and then you need to do some really careful measuring. So when you look at it, here's the back side. So the design is pretty straightforward, right? It's just an L. Comes out with a platform. Now, you want to design this so that you can find your zero, so that when the axle is sitting in here, it's right in line with your bottom bracket, and you call it 0. And now you want to design in at least 3 inches of rise. Okay, that will give you your bottom bracket drop in bike terms. Okay, so your jig needs to be able to make an adjustment, slide up about 3 inches and down to 0. Okay, makes sense? Now, when you make this L, there's a requirement that you need to find, and that is the distance from the surface of the jig, whether you're measuring from this side or the other side, out to your center line, right? And so a pair of calipers to make that measurement that you can then transpose onto your L brace. Okay, so you get that distance to where the mount for the dummy axle needs to be. Mark it. Like, this is just a piece of scrap, so it has holes. These do not line up. They're close, but center is a little off. Just a little bit. You can almost make that work. Anyway, so you need to make sure that you get that relationship. flat surface on this plate here on the back side so that they made up flat. And then however you decide to get this surface, this plate out here, it can be a flush mount with a notch that allows it to slide up and down and you can clamp. You can have it as a H beam where it slides up and down and pinches the beam here and then locks in place, but it needs to be straight. It needs to be perpendicular to that beam so that it matches and it is parallel with your bottom bracket axle. Are you getting what I'm saying? I keep saying it over and over and over because I want to drill this into you. You need to get perpendicularity, parallelism all the way through, and you need to be precise with this one. This is really critical. It has the most parts that you have to build up in order to get things out there. Okay, and here's like this 80-20 block could have been mounted like this, and because it's got slots, I could actually make the adjustment and offset it from these holes to pick up my parallel or my zero inboard outboard so it matches my bottom bracket, zero. Boy, that's just dirty. I think my lens was dirty. Anyway, so figure out how you're going to mount it and make sure that this is parallel to the surface and it's flush and it's flat. You don't want it kicked out like that because that then gives you that yaw in your axle that will throw your wheel off in one direction or another. All right. The pitch up and down is not all that important. I mean, it is, but it's not, because as long as it's still parallel, it's parallel. As long as it's not kicking up and down, you know, you're good. This is forward and aft. You can just lower it down a little bit or push it up depending on which way it's airing. But you can't have this, all right? And then if you have this kicking up, all right, now you need to compensate and kick it opposite direction. And that's why I'm saying you can do it two ways. You can build off of it from here backwards, depending on what your tooling is. If you don't have a mill or anything, you might have to do it this way and just compensate as you go back to mount to your jig. I have a cheap mill, and I have some flat stock aluminum that's already pretty flat. I don't really have to worry about it. So I'm going to just do it the old-fashioned way. Design it, engineer it, and build it, and then mount it. Okay? So that's pretty much it. And I invite you to go out and try it if you've built your jig. I don't know if you've gotten to that part yet, but if you hadn't, that is the basic concept, is make sure everything is perpendicular and parallel, and that you get the right height, your zero out, and then you need an adjustability of being able to slide this stanchion up to give you a rise, to raise the bottom bracket, or not bottom bracket, but your rear axle in relationship to your bottom bracket. Okay, and that is sometimes the most complex part of the jig, because every time you move it, you take the risk of it tweaking, right? And so you want to make sure that that's a robust design and that it locks down. If you can design in some sort of self-inspection so that you know that it's perpendicular and level, that's great. The same thing with the dummy axle. If you throw the dummy axle on it and you think it's on there correctly, and it's not. So, for example, on my dummy axle, I have these grooves in there. Okay, well, when I used the 80/20 block once, these grooves didn't sit really all that well into the notches in the 80/20, and it actually pushed up the axle so that it kicked up like that. Just ever so slightly, maybe a couple thousandths, but that translates quite a bit when you're moving away from zero, right? So think about how to make that so that it's self-indicating and indexing so that you know it's good. If it's not, then for all means, take a square or an angle finder of some sort, right, that you can use to check your angularity before you mount and weld your tubes to the bottom bracket. Because once they're on there, your only way you're going to fix your problem is to cut it off, and now you've made your chainstay shorter. So if you designed for a 17-inch chainstay, that's not bad, because you know you can always go to a 16.75, 16.5, or 16-inch chainstay, unless you have a fat 29er or a really fat 27.5, then you might be kicking yourself in the butt. But if you start out with a design of a 16-inch chainstay because you wanted a really aggressive hardtail, you're just SOL now. All right, so you're going to be cutting it off and grabbing a new chainstay. You're just SOL, and you'll end up cutting it off and biting the bullet and having to spend more money. Okay, and we don't want that. So take your time, get that all level, parallel, and perpendicular. All right, so go get that done, and I'll give you a quick blurb when I have mine done. I'll just show you what it looks like, and hopefully I heed everything I just told you to do. Okay, peace, good luck.